That's a gimme. That'll play.
Welcome back everyone to another year of Ancient DOS Games videos. I figured a good way to start the year would be with a game I've been wanting to cover for a while, not just because it's considered to be one of the best golf games ever released for DOS, but I'd also played it a bunch on friends' computers back in the 90s, yet never owned a copy myself until now. That game being Lynx 386 Pro. On the surface, this game can be very intimidating as it has quite the complex interface and golf lingo everywhere. This game strays somewhat into the strong simulation side of things, making an attempt to emulate many factors as realistically as possible, regardless of what those simulation aspects do to the actual experience. The result is a digitized golf game with a serious learning curve, which is probably going to decimate you in your first few attempts to actually succeed, regardless of how good you are at other such games. In fact, this game's been intentionally designed to be difficult to master, as some of the mystery of the underlying mechanics are not conveyed to the player, meaning you end up learning the hard way from failed shots just how tricky this game can get. Well, that doesn't make the game bad though, just very difficult. And while there are ways to mitigate the difficulty, it is ultimately just plain old golf, but with a bunch of extra features to take advantage of and extraordinarily good graphics for when this game was published.
Crushed that one.
Lynx 386 Pro was developed and released by Access Software in 1992, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone given that the game touts having real sound support, has the same 3-point swing system found in their original golf games, and even has some of the same sound effects from World Class Leaderboard brought over into this one. And it's technically a 0 to 8 player golf simulation game. I say technically because the game doesn't actually have any AI, but you can record your performance during a course and play back that performance during an actual game, meaning you can fill a game with pre-recorded golfers and just watch it play out. There's even command line parameters to force the game to run in a non-interactive demonstration mode, typically used by computer stores to help demonstrate the hardware they'd be selling. In terms of graphics, the game is only able to run in an SVGA 640x400 256 color mode, but supports showing the 640x400 render window inside a 640x480, 800x600, and 1024x768 screen space, just in case the 640x400 mode is not supported by the user's hardware, as many early SVGA drivers or even the CRT monitors themselves lacked support for it. And this is also pertinent because, again, this came out in 1992, so requiring an SVGA display device was kind of pushing the limits on what the average person's copy could do, as quite a lot of people simply didn't have that kind of hardware back then. Heck, the game even has a recommendation of 8 megabytes of RAM, again, way higher than what was typical of the time. In terms of sound, it only supports the PC speaker, AdLib, and Sound Blaster cards, and while it does use its real sound system Access Software developed for playing back digitized sounds over the PC speaker, apparently it has issues doing it here, as they hadn't yet perfected the real sound system to work within 32-bit protected mode. I should note though that there's also a CD release of this game, which came 3 years later, which added support for a plethora of additional audio devices. As for its current release state, it's still commercial, and the place to get it from is the Good Old Games website at www.gog.com, where it's available for $9.50. In fact, GOG has 3 different Lynx games for sale: the original Lynx, Lynx 386 Pro, and Lynx LS 1998, each priced the exact same. And they don't look like sale prices, so it's kind of weird pricing for them. Whatever, $9.50 each. But the bigger question is, do you really need all 3 of these games to get the full Lynx experience? Well, sort of. This kind of ties into the physical acquisition of the games nowadays, which is one heck of a rabbit hole to dive into, so I'm gonna do my best to explain what's going on. See, if you want a physical copy of Lynx 386 Pro, they're very easy to come across, typically fully boxed and typically very inexpensive, ranging between $10 and $20. And heck, you can even find Lynx 386 CD the same way, which is basically the same game, but with a couple additional minor features and better audio support. The trouble, though, if you want physical copies of these games to actually play, is that you're going to be missing a lot of the courses, as virtually every individual course for these games were each sold separately. Now, that may sound kind of scandalous at first, but one of the selling points for these games is that the courses are both backward and forward compatible. You can bring all the courses made for the original Lynx into Lynx 386 using an included conversion tool, and even once Lynx LS hit the scene, you could bring the Lynx LS courses backward into Lynx 386 Pro and even the original Lynx. This meant when you bought a new Lynx game, you could still play all of the courses you already owned, and as far as I can tell, that stayed pretty consistent. Up until Lynx LS 2000 came out, which, wouldn't you know it, came out around the same point in time Access Software was bought up by Microsoft. So the end of the cross-version support in that moment somehow doesn't surprise me. So yeah, if you want a physical copy, bear in mind that the physical releases of both Lynx and Lynx 386 Pro each only come with a single course, 2 courses with Lynx 386 CD, while the numerous physical copies of the quote championship courses are about the same price each when you can find them, between $10 and $20. And there's a ton of them to buy if you want all of the courses. However, the GOG release of Lynx 386 Pro comes with all 18 of the courses released specifically for both the original Lynx and Lynx 386 Pro, while Lynx LS 1998 only comes with the 4 courses it originally came with. So at the very least, to get as many courses as possible to play just with GOG purchases, you need both Lynx 386 Pro and Lynx LS. The original Lynx is only necessary for sake of nostalgia. I also want to quickly mention a couple other things too. As far as I can tell, Lynx 2003 Championship Edition is considered the best of the Lynx games, at least at present, as for a very long time it was the last Lynx game to be released on PC and featured 26 courses in total. But I haven't ever played it, and I'm only going by anecdotal comments I've read about it being the best of the bunch, so that would be the one to look into for those so inclined. However, there's also a relatively new free game on Steam released halfway through 2021 called Lynx E6. Now, firstly, this sounds like kind of a weird name, but also I'm told it's not actually all that good due to a couple shortcomings with the swing system in place and the lack of certain kinds of club-related stats. But this isn't unexpected given that the current license holder of the Lynx brand and the company which developed this game is TruGolf, a company which primarily deals with proper golf simulator hardware. As in the really expensive stuff where you swing actual clubs and such. The E6 branding in particular relates to their proprietary network which interconnects all of their simulators and software so that no matter which hardware or software players are using, they can all compete with each other from anywhere in the world. Basically, Lynx E6 itself is still far too new and coming from a developer with no PC gaming experience, thus why it has extremely powerful tech behind it, yet doesn't play all that well. Yet. With a little luck, TruGolf will listen to the complaints about Lynx E6 and make the experience better over time, as I have a funny feeling they're not going anywhere anytime soon. Okay, so back to Lynx 386 Pro. When you first start this game, you're shown an advertising screen to book reservations to play at one of the real courses related to a particular course that you have installed. Which, I mean, I get it, but a lot of people play digitized golf because they can't play real golf for whatever reason. Either because it's too expensive, too difficult, or in my case, legitimately dangerous due to ligament issues with my knees. But in any case, after this, you go to the main menu and can set up your options, create or edit a player, or start playing the game. And typically the first thing you want to do is create a player, since this not only lets you set your own personal default options, but more importantly, it lets you select your clubs. Now, there's actually a massive array of clubs available in here, including the often unseen 6 and 7 woods, 1 and 2 irons, and the seemingly legendary lob wedge, unseen in almost every other digital golf game ever made, which the manual incorrectly calls a loft wedge for whatever reason. Likely just the manual writer being confused, since loft is used to refer to the angle of the head on a golf club. There's also 2 different drivers you can choose between called D1 and D2, which both have the same range. So what's the actual difference between them? Well, the manual indicates that both drivers can hit the same distance on average, but that D1 flies faster with less height and D2 flies slower with more height, meaning a ball hit with D1 will hit the ground sooner but roll further due to the extra speed, while a ball hit with D2 can get over trees more easily and hit the ground later, but rolls less. Yet, under ideal conditions with perfect swings, the total distance from both drivers will be the same. To actually begin playing, you have a choice between playing a full set of 18 holes of a course, the front or back 9 holes of a course, or you can also select the practice mode to play just a single hole on any course. Now curiously, there's no driving range and no putting green to practice on, which is an intentional omission as the devs figured being able to practice individual holes made more sense than having a driving range, which kinda misses the point of why driving ranges are a thing, but whatever. Since there's a mulligan system in the game, you can just take a mulligan after every swing, and that effectively works similar to taking swings over and over again on a driving range. Now, the game doesn't have AI-based players, but does offer the ability to load recorded players, effectively allowing you to play against a pre-recorded run through a course. And the main selling point here is being able to record yourself playing through a round and then being able to give that recording to a friend so they can challenge you on the same course. Though you can also use the recording system to challenge yourself as well. The only trick with recorded players is that certain features such as wind are incompatible with them, so ultimately it could have used some extra work. You also choose which colored tees to start on as well as your difficulty level between beginner, amateur, and pro. The pro setting basically runs the game as intended, but this also means you get serious accuracy and distance penalties if you miss the mark on perfect shots by more than just a couple pixels. The amateur setting relaxes the accuracy necessary to hit your shot straight and to the intended distance. However, to compensate and balance this with pro players, the maximum distance you can hit all of your clubs is reduced slightly. The beginner setting is effectively the same as the amateur setting, but reduces the maximum distance you can hit the ball even more in exchange for negating all wind regardless of the wind setting for the game. When you're actually in the game, you'll notice a massive number of things in the bottom status bar, each of which is important to some degree. Going from left to right, we first get info on the current player preparing to hit the ball, buttons to set up your shot stance, see the top view of the hole, see the current scores, or drop the ball elsewhere nearby. Now I should note, the drop feature only counts for a single stroke and lets you drop the ball pretty much anywhere, so it's up to the players playing to agree on what seems to be within reason when manually dropping the ball, or having to drop after going out of bounds or in the water. The flag button is kind of an important one since it will cause the flag to zoom in from wherever it is on screen to give you an idea of where you should be aiming, as the rise and fall of the landscape may make this difficult to gauge, especially since you have to aim by right-clicking on the main view, and the default aiming direction, while not usually bad, sometimes doesn't go where you'd want or expect it to. The swing button's pretty obvious, and we'll talk about swinging the club in a minute. But next to that, you have your buttons for selecting your types of shots, including straight shots, shots which draw to the left, shots which fade to the right, chip shots, putting, as well as 2 user shots. As when you set up a custom shot, you can change a lot of specs towards how you hit the ball, and then save these specs on a per club basis to the user selections. Do keep in mind though that the foot stance is the one and only aspect of setting up custom shots, which has absolutely no effect, and is mostly just for your own reference. Next is the gimme button, which allows you to clear the hole if the ball is close enough to being in the hole. Then you have the rotate button, so you can spin the view to face the direction you want, a lie indicator showing you what condition the ball is in, and then finally your club selection and wind. Now, if you have wind enabled, you'll notice that it's constantly shifting in direction and intensity, thus why it can't be enabled when recording a player for later playback. Though really, there are ways they could have accounted for this if they'd actually written their own random number generator. You may have noticed by now too that the window is sometimes split into multiple windows. You have various display options, which can really help give you a good overview of what's going on, though there are limitations to which information you can put into which sizes and shapes of windows. I typically prefer the 3-window form with a big vertical window for the main view, and 2 small windows for an overhead view and green view. Okay, let's talk about actually hitting the ball because this is what makes or breaks any golf game. As mentioned earlier, the game works on a 3-point system. First, you hold down the swing button to start the swing, release the swing button when it's at the level of power you want, Then click the swing button one final time to set your swing accuracy near the bottom. If you perfectly hit the ball from the tee or fairway with perfectly vertical yellow marks on the swing gauge, the ball should go the exact distance stated on your club selector, not taking into account what kind of surface the ball lands on or any wind. But what about when you don't hit these marks perfectly? Well, that's where this game starts to get ambiguous. Firstly, you'll notice there's 7 additional pips on the power gauge, which is an odd quantity to have, and they're not spaced evenly either. So what distance do you actually get when you hit these pips? Couldn't tell you, as it seems to differ based on a variety of factors, including what the ball's lying on, the angle of the surface the ball is lying on, the club you have selected, even the wind seems to screw with this to some extent. Best I can tell, the first pip down from the top is roughly 85% power, and the next tick down is roughly 70%, and then each tick down is another 10% drop. But this is a very rough estimate and often not reliable. Then you have the accuracy point. This isn't just an accuracy in terms of slicing the ball or hooking it, but also affects the strength of the shot. At pro skill, even being just a couple pixels off from a perfectly accurate shot drops the distance the ball can travel considerably. But so long as you don't try to overswing the club, you'll only slice or hook badly if you're way off the mark. If you do attempt to overswing into the red zone, you can get a full 33% more distance out of your club if you're lucky, but you absolutely need to nail that center mark for accuracy, because even being just 1 pixel off can send the ball flying somewhere you didn't intend it to go. The other really important thing I need to point out is that your club selection shows the maximum travel distance possible, including ball roll. The different clubs will cause the ball to land well before these points, and then the rest of the distance achieved is bounce and roll. This means if the ball lands somewhere where it can't bounce or roll, you'll get a lot less distance. Or worse still, you need to account for this manually when trying to get over any sort of hazard, since if you choose a club which will only just barely do the trick, and then miss the mark on the accuracy, the ball's probably going to hit said hazard. I also want to quickly point out that address button there. This lets you change if you're addressing the ball or not, meaning if you turn this off, you can practice your swings without actually hitting the ball, which is definitely something you want to do a few times before each shot if you're still learning the nuances and timings for this game. Once you're on the green, a grid will automatically appear to help you gauge the angles of the green surface, as you'll need to take this into account to some extent when putting. However, unlike with a lot of older golf simulators, you also need to set accuracy for putting, and being just a couple pixels off with pro skill putting can really screw up your shots. The putting in this game takes a lot of practice to dial in. You're not going to be able to just dive in and do it right.
Great par.
In fact, that's pretty much what this whole game comes down to, is that you can't just dive in and expect to do well. Like real golf, this game takes a lot of practice to learn all of its nuances, since the manual, despite being nearly 70 pages long, does not dive into any of the specifics of how its physics system is playing out. You have to learn all of this through trial and error, which in some ways adds realism to the game, but in other ways can make this a very tricky game to learn how to play on the pro skill setting. And whether that's a good or bad thing really comes down to personal preference. The last thing to mention is that when you complete a full set of 9 or 18 holes, you not only get to see a final scorecard, but also get to look at a final stats screen showing a huge number of stats to help you gauge how well you were playing. Plus, there's lots of options throughout the program for printing info on a printer in case you want to track these things over time. Oh, and also, thanks to the power of video editing, I was able to do a little experiment here to see exactly how the rendering engine was doing its thing, producing a full 360-degree spinning view from a single spot. Now, right away, one of the things I noticed was that the texturing is fixed, just flat painted onto whatever surface it's being drawn on, and that it's the shading of each surface based on its angle to the sun, which helps to sell the look of the world. The rendering is otherwise pretty straightforward, thus why even on systems just a couple years more modern than when this game came out, the rendering could be done almost in real time. Overall, I understand why Lynx 386 Pro is considered one of the best golf simulators for DOS, but it's also one of the most difficult to get into because of the emphasis on simulating so many aspects to feel as real as possible. Now true, you can turn down the skill settings, but in a strange way that's just sort of breaking the illusion that you're playing the game as a pro golfer. A part of the reason for playing any game is escapism, but escapism is a tricky thing when it comes to any sort of simulator, as now the question is how much do you favor skill and realism over fun and accessibility? And this game definitely leans more so towards the skill and realism side of things. That said, this still remains one of the best golf games ever made for DOS, regardless of how you look at it. So I would say if you're into golf simulators, then you definitely want to give this one a try if you never have. If you're not into golf simulators, but still want to try one out, then while this isn't a bad one by any stretch of the imagination, it's one you'll probably want to wait to try until you try an easier golf sim first for a more modern system. Get a taste for if there's even a chance that you'll like a more advanced golf sim before you sink any cash into this one, given the steep learning curve and necessity to practice the heck out of it if you want any hope of getting any good scores. As for setting this up in DOSBox, just leave cycle set to auto and it should run fine. However, double check to make sure aspect correction is on and that you're running DOSBox in a rendering mode which can handle this, such as the OpenGL mode. The game is supposed to run in a 4:3 aspect, which given a resolution of 640 by 400 should be stretched vertically to some extent, meaning if you leave aspect correction off, this won't happen and the game world will seem squished somewhat, which, given the level of accuracy needed to survive this thing, you probably want to get this right. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, a couple Saturdays from now, on January 15th, will be another review, episode 295, where we're going to be taking a look at an FMV-based game, which I promised we'd get to within a year, about 5 years ago. Well, hey, better late than never, right? Ugh. I mean, come on, I'm one person making videos. I can only produce so much content, and it completely skipped my mind that I'd intended to cover this one, and no one reminded me. I mean, maybe that's a sign I shouldn't be covering it? Yeah, whatever, let's do it anyways, so make sure you stay tuned for it.
Nice par.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.
Oh, it's in the deep stuff.
Be the club.
Great shot. Good save.